everybody. We're going to give a second for everybody to get in. Last day. Thank you for joining us this week. For those of you who have been joining every day, we appreciate it.
Sure everyone's going that are happy about this being the last day.
It's a lot of education, that is for sure.
Yep.
Yesterday was beefy too. We had managers, board meetings, and reserves. So it was a
Uh,
beefy
Good
day.
topics.
Yes. And then day one, we started with insurance and financials.
Oh
So we
man.
hit the ground running.
Yeah, I just did a
Definitely.
webinar 2 days ago dealing with the LA fires, and
Mm,
insurance was a big topic.
yes. Yeah. Our insurance speakers had to kind of disclose that this was not a discussion about the current market. It was, general. Yeah. So that was really difficult. But the thing. Okay, I'm going to get through this script so we can get to the content because we got a lot of great content for you again today. So here we go. Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed your second day of the program, and we will quickly move into our last day today. We couldn't do any of this without our sponsors, so we're going to let our sponsors come on and have a couple seconds to say hello. Is anyone here from Associa, Northern California? Okay, well, thank you, Associa. I know Josh Renwick is here for Good Life, so I'm going to give him a second to say hello. Oh, you're muted, sorry.
Hello, good. This is our final day. It's been great, 3-day venture with everybody that's on here. Congratulations. I am Josh with Good Life. We are your local family-owned business. They have construction that can do your major improvements, your capital jobs, capital improvement jobs. We actually have a handyman division that can do the smaller jobs. So big to small, we do it all. We have a restoration for water losses and fire. We actually have a pest control division, and we also have an inspection and plans and permitting department. So if any of those things you guys need estimates coming out through the year, please keep us in mind. Reach out to me, and you will see me at LSCA events. So I hope to see you guys there.
Thank you, Josh. We appreciate
Thank
you.
you.
Okay. All right. And then I know Brenda told me that she could not make it this morning from CID Consortium, but we have been seeing Brenda for the last 2 days. So thank you, Brenda and CID Consortium. Thank you, sponsors in general. Please consider our sponsors when you are planning projects or need help in your community. Sponsors, please feel free to post your information in the chat for the attendees. It will also be included in my wrap up email at the end of the day. $5 Starbucks gift cards will be sent to all homeowner leaders and managers at the conclusion of this event this afternoon. I will also try to get you your certificates this afternoon, but it might be by Friday at the latest. Housekeeping. We are recording this meeting. Please keep your microphone on mute. We will be taking questions via the chat function at the bottom of the Zoom screen to be answered at the end in the order they were received. So if you have some questions for the Q&A portion as well, you can start plugging those in there and I'll get those into the document. Handouts will also be sent this afternoon in the wrap up email, so please make sure to be on the lookout for that. And let's get the education started. Our first session today is a big one, CID Law and Rule Enforcement. Please welcome Ellen Schuster from Hughes, Gill, Cochrane, Tinetti, PC, Adrian Adams from Adams STIRLING, PLC, and John Hansen from Baydaline and Jacobsen, LLP. Take it away, speakers.
All right, thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you today, and we look forward to covering this topic today and giving you some great information that you can use to help guide you in governing your associations. We're going to cover a good variety of legal topics today, starting first with an overview of what associations are, different types of common interest developments, how they're formed, their governing documents. Then we're going to work into rights and obligations at the developer level, owners, board members, officers, and committees, and then work into the enforcement process, rules, how they're adopted, and how they're enforced. So we're going to get kind of a start to finish review of an association being created and then how it is managed when it comes to rule enforcement. When it comes to homeowner associations or common interest developments, they wear many hats all at one time. And understanding this will help you in really understanding your role as a board member and how you can manage your association effectively. A common interest development and a community association, particularly, is both a corporation, a business, a real estate project, a community, and sort of overarching is kind of a mini government. So it has all of these things happening at one time. And if you swing too far in one direction or the other, you can lose sight of one of them. So if you think too much of it like a business, you can lose sight of the fact that it's a community. Or if you think too much of it as being a community, you may all of a sudden stop enforcing the rules, which are an important part of what the association is. So today, one of our goals is to show you how you can balance that by the way that you approach serving on the board, the actions that you take, and the understanding of how you can effectively communicate that with your homeowners. Let's start first, though, with the types of communities and what they are, what they look like.
Okay, the types listed here, you'll see that there's five of them, but actually there are four legal structures, and one of them is not listed here. You've got cooperatives, typically stock cooperatives, condominiums, planned developments, and what's missing here are what's called community apartment projects or own your owns, or also called tenancies in common. You'll see them most often in San Francisco. And then you have mixed use and master associations. Of the cooperatives, most of those are on the East Coast. There aren't that many here in California. They tend to be in the older cities, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, and a lot of them, at least in LA, have been converted into condominiums. What you see most often are what's listed here. Are condominiums, planned developments, mixed use, and master associations. Master associations would typically have sub-associations under them. John or Ellen, do you guys want to add anything to this? Okay, let's go to the next slide.
One comment on that is really understanding your type of development is important, because I've had many clients who have said to me, "Oh, we have condos," or but they're actually townhomes. So that can make a difference as far as what laws apply to you. Understanding that exact type of development you are.
And on that note, I'm glad you brought up the term townhomes, because townhomes they don't have a legal definition as a type of CID. So when someone says townhomes, we still have to pull that apart a little bit and figure out, is that a condo? Is it a planned development? Could it be something else? So townhome typically refers to the way that the building was structured, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what we need to know about the legal type of community.
Yeah, those are good points. I agree with John and Ellen, in that you can't tell by looking at a structure what the legal structure is. You have to look at the documents. So the CC&Rs will tell you whether it's a condominium or a planned development, because townhome construction can be either condos or planned development. Okay, so the types of legal documents are next. And associations are under a fair number of laws, but also the documents are very important in controlling and guiding an association. You'll see on the right side there a list, the declarations, which are commonly referred to as CC&Rs, articles of incorporation, condominium plan, bylaws, and rules and regulations. And there is a hierarchy established by the Davis-Stirling Act. And that hierarchy, when there's a conflict, is this. The law is at the top. So if there's a conflict between the document, the law will control. Then come the CC&Rs. Under that are the articles of incorporation. And under that is not the condominium plan. Condominium plan is not actually in the hierarchy. Next are the bylaws, and then rules and regulations. But the condominium plan or subdivision map is one of the legal documents that affect associations. And one of the things that we look at as lawyers when we're giving a legal opinion regarding maintenance responsibilities or other issues that might involve the condominium plan or subdivision map. So, John or Ellen, anything you want to add? Okay, Ellen, you're next.
Well, on the CC&R side, there are a number of things to keep in mind. And you will hear these called CC&Rs. You'll hear them called the Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions. If you were wondering what CC&Rs meant, that's what that means. Sometimes you just hear it called the Declaration. They're all referring to this document. The CC&Rs are a legal contract that bind the owner and the association. And they're a public document because they're recorded in the county where the association is located. The CC&Rs themselves, in order to distinguish among all of the different types, I just want to talk a little bit about what the CC&Rs typically contain. You've probably seen your own CC&Rs, and if you haven't, I encourage you to look at them. But they are what tells you what you can and cannot do with real property. So they can be amended, but amending what everyone is allowed to do and not do with their real property, as you might imagine, requires the members who are bound to this to approve it. And the approval requirements can vary. So it says here on the screen where the document does not indicate more than 50% of the total membership is required. What that means is if the CC&Rs do not tell you what percentage approval you need in order to amend them, then there is a statutory default that you can use. But it's important to look at the document itself first. Most of them, we'll go with many of them. I'd like to think most of them at this point have the approval requirements contained within them, but there are always notable exceptions. And there is an option for a court petition. We typically will call it something like the 4275 petition because it's something that happens under Civil Code section 4275. But the court petition can help with the amendment process if the association does not receive the required number of approval, does not receive the required quorum in order to get to where we need to get the approval. But I don't want you to overly focus on this part because there are certain criteria that have to be met under that statute. So I'm going to leave it at this. This is a contract that binds every owner. It binds the association. It's recorded in the county where the association is located. And because it is recorded, every single owner is deemed on notice, on constructive notice, whether they've read them or not, when they buy into the community. All right, and then next, the condominium plan or subdivision map. Adrian talked a little bit about this. This is an original map of the structure itself, or the structures and the community. And it's typically submitted, it's required for the developer to submit. And it does become a recorded document. It's also recorded in the county where the association is located. And it is often used to determine associations versus owner responsibility for maintenance of certain components, maintenance, repair, and replacement of certain components. So it can be helpful in that way. It is considered a part of the governing documents. It is one of the governing documents. And one key to remember with this one, to contrast it with what we talked about with the CC&Rs, is that in order to amend a condominium plan, it actually requires 100% of members' approval, and that's something that's in the Civil Code.
Ellen, on this, going back to can you go back, John, just one? Oh, there. Okay, the condominium plan. I've noticed in older developments that it wasn't necessarily recorded with the CC&Rs and they were lost. Nobody can find them. So, and I don't know, are either one of you, where can you get them through the state? Through the Department of Real Estate?
I have not had the pleasure.
Yeah, it may be possible if you don't have this particular document and you need it, you may be able to get it through the Department of Real Estate. Yeah, and if so, you may want to record it. Okay, that's my only comment on that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
The Articles of Incorporation are actually just usually the first governing document because they create the association. But after that, they don't really have a lot of use in day-to-day operations. So it's kind of a document that gets forgotten and ignored. And for, I would say, post-1990 Articles of Incorporation, you don't really need them for much. They describe the association's purpose, they're filed with the Secretary of State, and that's sort of it. However, if you have articles that were prepared and filed pre 1990, you always want to reference those when you are doing things like applying for a bank loan, because they may have restrictions on lending requirements. They may say, in order for the association to borrow money, a certain percentage of members must approve. So for a while, that was a common thing that you would actually find limitations on authority in articles of incorporation. But most modern ones are, 1 or 2 pages. They're pretty basic and straightforward. They can be updated if you want to, especially if you're changing an association's name. You can update them, but otherwise they just kind of sit with the Secretary of State, and that's all they do.
One of the things I've seen in articles is that they might have a different number of directors than the bylaws. So, and that's something that you may need to amend to match them up with the bylaws, because that can be problematic.
Yeah, excellent point. In fact, I did that recently, amending an association's bylaws. We wanted to change the number of directors, and we had to amend the articles also to accomplish that. So that's an excellent point.
Right.
Also, the articles are sort of a sleeper. They rarely get attention, but every so often I look at them when I'm looking at everything all together, and I find that they, in fact, have a lot of very useful information that would not have been found had they not been consulted. So I think articles in some associations, people just think, oh, we don't have to think about these things, but they can really contain some important information. Perhaps it's information we'd prefer to find elsewhere in the CC&Rs or bylaws, but there are times when we do have to consult them. So I don't want anyone to think that they're a throwaway document that should never be consulted.
Yeah, good points. The bylaws are the corporate governance document. Bylaws are not recorded with the county, but they are still relevant to the association's day-to-day operations. They still are one of the most important corporate documents. Bylaws are dealing with corporate governance activities, voting, meetings, how the board is elected through a nomination process, who serves on the board, director qualifications, officers, committees. All of that corporate governance activities are addressed in the bylaws. So they are very relevant to the association's day-to-day operations. And when associations are thinking about, do they have to update their governing documents, it is often the bylaws that become the most outdated when it comes to the law, because a lot of our legal updates each year are dealing with bylaw type issues. So, CC&Rs don't typically get out of date with the law very often. They will on some things like rentals or flags or solar panels. But for the most part, the legal changes we're seeing each year are bylaw related issues. Bylaws can be amended by a vote of the members. The requirement for that's going to be set forth in the bylaws, and it's often a majority of a quorum or a majority of the entire membership. And you'll want to refer to your bylaws for how those can be updated, what the approval requirement is for updating your bylaws.
Okay, on rules and regulations. Let's compare those to understand them a little bit better. It's like the Constitution of the United States lays out certain things. Well, the CC&Rs lay out certain things, but then the board gets to expand on those through rules and regulations, just as legislators do with the laws. So as Ellen pointed out, the CC&Rs can only be amended by the membership, whereas the rules and regulations can be adopted and amended by the board of directors. And their purpose is to deal with day-to-day living in the community, and frankly, to try and keep peace in the community. So it's saying what members can and can't do, dealing with pets and parking and those kinds of things. And there is before a board can adopt any changes to rules, there's a 28-day waiting period where they send them out to the membership for comment, for review and comment. And then the board is to take those comments into consideration before adopting them at their next board meeting. And one thing I might add here is that election rules, with the new electronic voting, if you want to include those in your election rules, I wouldn't wait to amend those later. I'd start that process now, because there's a long lead time in doing that, getting those to be effective so that you can use electronic voting. So John or Ellen, anything you want to add?
All good.
Okay, book of resolutions. Containing major board decisions. Frankly, I've only got one association that does resolutions. All other associations do motions in their minutes. So I don't see this as being very common. And frankly, the resolutions that this association does, they don't even maintain them in a book. Resolutions are more formalized motions, if you want to look at it that way, with a whereas, therefore. Whereas with a motion, you just make a motion and it gets adopted. And it's recorded in the minutes. So John or Ellen, do you guys, either one of you have associations that use resolutions?
Yeah, I have one client that's very, very organized on their governance. It's a very large community, and they do resolutions pretty regularly on their bigger issues, like changing a set of rules or establishing a new fee for using the clubhouse or things of a bigger nature. They'll do resolutions, which actually is quite organized because then we can go back through and see them all. But for the most part, our clients don't do a lot of written resolutions, except when it comes to a big issue like when you're required to, borrowing from reserves, special assessment, things like that. But for the most part, there's not a lot of written resolutions.
Yeah, I would agree. I also see them sometimes when a board member is being censured, but otherwise it's not a super common occurrence. All right, so we're going to move into board member fiduciary duty and responsibilities. So before we get into this topic, I want to just define our terms a little bit. A fiduciary is a person to whom property or power is entrusted for the benefit of another. And the reason why it's important to understand that is because under the law, the fiduciary duty is the highest duty of care and loyalty recognized by the law. So we like to say sometimes that board members owe a dual fiduciary duty, both to the association and to all of its members. So with that, let's talk a little bit about what all of that means. All of the different constituents involved in HOAs have different rights and obligations. So you can see a list here on the slide of some of those different parties. We are focusing on board member rights and obligations, mostly obligations, because the nature of your obligations is so important and so serious because you are in fact being entrusted with the property and money of others and making decisions about those things and potentially spending those things. So your responsibilities on the next slide are to preserve, protect, and enhance property value, period. Your job is not to save your neighbor's money. I know that that is very hard for lots of board members to hear, but your job is actually to spend money. That is not to say that your job is to spend money frivolously. That is not at all what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that in order to meet your obligation to preserve, protect, and enhance property values, you are going to have to spend some money to do those things. So we're going to talk about how that happens. So before we get to this one, Adrian and John, anything else you want to add here?
Yeah, let me comment on that because this is a
Sure.
really good point. There are too many boards that they think that their duty is to not spend any money at all. And they defer maintenance, defer, and they do a lot of other things they shouldn't be doing. And when in reality, their obligation is to maintain the property, which means they need to spend money. So they need to put money in reserves. And I had one association, no, we can't ever touch reserves. You can never spend money out of reserves. No, actually, you have an obligation to spend money out of reserves to take care of those reserve items. So I don't know, John, have you experienced anything along those lines?
Yeah, I absolutely have. And it's important to think about the long game when it comes to your financing or the financial management of the association, because if you are not sufficiently maintaining the property, then over time the property is going to lose value, and that's going to start affecting home sales. It's going to start affecting lending. It's going to start affecting the bottom line for everybody. And so spending $1 today is earning an extra dollar later on that property value, that once you start going down that path of deferred maintenance and under assessing then it's hard to come back from that.
Yeah, and the
I've
worst
also,
case scenario would be the Champlain Towers in Florida, Surfside, Florida, where they
exactly.
didn't maintain, and finally the building collapsed. It killed 97 people.
Exactly. And we do see in California, we do see instances where deferred maintenance has gotten so bad that it does cause health and safety risks and can result in those kinds of,
Emergency special assessments, very
yep,
large ones. I think the worst case one I had was what, $97,000 per unit special assessment.
yep.
Well, with all this in mind, it's important to consider what the board's powers and the board's duties are. Duties are the things the board must do, and the powers are the things that the board can do. So the board can levy certain assessments, but on the other hand, the board must levy certain assessments. In fact, the Civil Code says the association shall levy assessments sufficient to meet the association's needs. So it's not even as if it's an option; it is a mandate that assessments are levied to meet the association's needs. There is a balancing there, of course, with good fiscal management, with getting bids, with making sure contractors are doing the job appropriately, with making sure that you are finding ways to effectively perform those maintenance obligations. But under assessing or deferring maintenance is never going to be the answer. When directors are elected, there's often a time for an attitude check. This is not an attitude check as in you are going about it the wrong way, but it's getting a different perspective on what your role is in serving on the board. You are a volunteer who has then been entrusted with everyone else's assets. So the members are placing all of their real estate value in your hands. And it's important to remember that they have entrusted you with something very important by electing you or by allowing a process for you to be appointed to the board. So it's really important to take that seriously. In fact, it's a great honor to serve on a board because you are able to impact somebody else's home value and the most important investment they probably have in their lives. And so always having that perspective going into board meetings that I'm here with someone else's trust is an important way to approach it. And also to recognize that people, because it is their home, it's where they live and it's where all their investment is, are often very sensitive to things that are happening with their home and to their pocketbook. So keeping that in mind when someone comes to a meeting very upset is to understand where they're coming from, that this is the most important thing in their lives. And if they feel like it's being mismanaged, they're going to have a strong reaction. Doesn't mean they should yell at you, but understanding where they are and having that empathy will help you realize that what you're doing is very important and it really makes a difference to people. You are much more likely to be a positive force in your community if you view your position as a position of service. If members come into a meeting knowing these board members are here to serve me, they're here with a humble and gracious attitude, that's going to really make a difference. They're really going to experience that. And I was even talking to a client this week about that, saying, board, I understand that directors have different perspectives on things, but when they see directors arguing with each other or undermining each other, the members lose confidence because they think I entrusted my entire home value to these people and they can't even get along and get through a meeting without being critical and nasty towards each other. They can't compromise on anything. And members start to lose that confidence and trust in the board, and that's really hard in the community. So it's important to keep that level of humility and service when you are on the board and in your board meetings, and never forgetting that what you're doing is very important. It's very selfless. It's a very honorable job to be serving on a board, and you should always feel good about that, even when you are abused or mistreated. Understand that people are doing it because you're touching a very sensitive place in their lives, but you can still serve them in a very important way.
Okay, Ellen introduced this section on fiduciary duty, and here's the Black Laws Dictionary definition. Duty to act for someone else's benefit while subordinating one's personal interest to that of the other person. And it's the highest standard of duty implied by law. And once a director, it's interesting, as a homeowner, you don't have any fiduciary duties to other homeowners, to the board, to the association. But once you get elected to the board of directors, you immediately become a fiduciary. The next slide, a fiduciary person who occupies a position of trust and confidence, and actually a higher or highest position. So directors must meet those high standards, and there are basically two broad duties, fiduciary duties that directors have. First one I'm going to look at is the duty of care. So meaning they must be diligent in performing their duties, attending and participating in board meetings, which is a requirement that some directors don't seem to honor very well. But we add to bylaws, probably Ellen, your firm too, and John, that if they miss so many meetings in a row that they can be removed from the board, because it's important that they attend, make quorum, and participate in meetings. And the duty of care means they must make reasonable inquiry. So this duty to investigate. If an issue is brought to the board, they have a duty to investigate the issue. Now, that doesn't mean that they personally have to go investigate it. They might have their manager or a contractor. They can have someone else go and investigate and report back to the board, but they have that duty. And a good example is a case called the Affin versus Portofino, where over a period of 10 years, one of the owner's unit continued to have sewage backups into the unit. And the association, each time it was reported, the board would then have the line cleared. So they call the plumber and they clear the line. What they didn't do was investigate to find out what was causing the backups and then fix it. And so they got sued. And this went all the way up to the California Supreme Court, which said that the boards have a duty to investigate. And so not just prepare, but find out what was causing the problem and fix it. So this is the duty of care. Okay, the next one is the duty of loyalty. So the directors have a duty to put the association's interest ahead of their own. And so sometimes that means making a decision that would hurt them personally, but would benefit the association. It also means that if they have a conflict of interest, they have a duty to disclose it. So if there's going to be roof repairs or roof replacement that's going to be done, and the director has an ownership interest in a roofing company and is recommending that company, he needs to disclose that he's got that interest, and he needs to recuse himself or herself from voting on the issue, because there's conflict of interest here. And it can even extend to family members. A family member, they have a son that owns the company. Well, they need to disclose that and recuse themselves. So, and this is something that John and Ellen, you guys may want to comment on.
Well, one thing I wanted to add about making reasonable inquiry and relying on professionals is that I do see from time to time boards who are using their own common sense to ferret out issues and determine how to make sense of them and what to do. It's not to say that using your own best judgment is wrong, but when you have a legal issue, you have to call a lawyer, and when you have a plumbing issue, you have to call a plumber. And so it is not enough to say, oh, well, I've done this before, or I've seen this before, and here's what happened. It's actually incumbent on you, I would argue, as part of your fiduciary duty to the association and its members, to get that expert to investigate and make an assessment of the situation and advise you as board members as to what is going on and what the options are.
That's a good point.
Yep.
So that brings us to one of our favorites, the business judgment rule. The business judgment rule essentially says that if you make decisions the right way, then your decisions will be protected. Meaning, the court is not going to second guess the decisions that board members make when they make the decisions properly, even though hindsight is 20/20. You make the decision by acting with the same level of care and skill as an ordinarily prudent person would in a similar business, which is a very roundabout and long way of saying to act prudently and minimize risks, to do exactly as Adrian has said, act with your duty of care. You be diligent in performing the duties you've undertaken, act within the scope of your authority, make the reasonable inquiry, contact the professionals and get the expert opinions, and uphold your duty of loyalty. And if you make the decision the right way by doing all of those things, then even if the decision turns out to be, I'm going to use wrong in quotes, right? Because we didn't know, we couldn't see the future, or someone happens to disagree, or the results of that very rational decision turn out to be not rational, unfortunately. Your decision is going to be protected. And we want your decisions to be protected because you are volunteers and you did not sign up to take on risk. So this is a very long way of saying that you are going to be protected by the association and, frankly, hopefully, your directors and officers insurance policy that the association takes out. If you act the way you are supposed to act and make decisions the way you are supposed to make decisions. Now, there's a couple of notes on this that I just want to make sure you understand. One is that the business judgment rule will protect you even if the board's decision is not to act, but it is not going to protect you if you just don't make a decision. So what's important is to think about this in terms of doing the reasonable inquiry and making an affirmative decision. We are going to take this step. We are not going to take any more steps. This is why we've decided this, as opposed to just saying, I don't really want to deal with that. Or I think that's a neighbor to neighbor issue and we're just going to ignore these complaints or what have you. And what that does when you have the business judgment rule apply, is it will protect you as an individual person from personal liability, something we often call safe harbor. So there are a lot of reasons that the business judgment rule is important. And I think the main takeaway here, and I'll defer to Adrian and John in a moment on this too, but I think the most important takeaway here is that if you make the decisions in the right way, you and your board and your association and you personally are going to be protected. And that's really what we want for you. Adrian and John, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, let me add an example of a board that was not protected by the business judgment rule. This was following the Northridge earthquake, where there was a lot of rebuilding that had to be done. Association didn't have sufficient, in fact, I don't think they had any earthquake insurance. And so it was special assessment to pay for the rebuilding. They hired a contractor is doing the work. Election takes place, new board president, and he says, you know what, we can get this done for a lot cheaper. He had looked into and found a contractor that could do it for a lot less money. And so they discussed it in executive session and decided what they would do, because they had a contract with this existing contractor, was to make it so difficult for the contractor that they could drive him out and then bring in the new contractor, which they did. So they met the element of they believed that they were acting in the best interest of their community because they could reduce the amount of money that is in the special assessment. And they did their reasonable inquiry and they found out that they could do it cheaper. Where they failed was in good faith. It wasn't in good faith that they were acting. And the other problem they had was that they recorded all of their executive session meetings where they discussed all of this. And that all came out in the lawsuit that followed, and they got nailed for it. So you have to meet all three elements in order to be protected as directors. So you have to be acting in good faith, in a manner which you believe in the best interest of the association, and with reasonable inquiry. And then you can make a mistake in judgment, and you're still protected. You're not going to be responsible personally for that mistake in judgment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. All excellent points. And one other final point on that, and then we'll go on to our next topic, is you have to comply with the law. So I've heard often a board will say, well, we're not going to do our, that requirement under the civil code. We'll just say business judgment rule. No, the law has to be followed. There's no exception there. It's these areas where there's some subjective discretion. That's where this really comes into play. So following the laws is sort of a first layer you must satisfy before you even get into this defense. Our next topic is the roles of officers. And officers are positions that are assigned amongst the board. Officers aren't elected by the members. The members elect directors, and the directors decide amongst themselves who's going to be president, vice president, treasurer or CFO, and then secretary. The officer positions are often defined in your bylaws, and there is some definition in the corporations code, but really it's going to be in your bylaws that you find definitions of officer positions. For the most part, your bylaws are going to be pretty generic when it comes to what the officers do. There's some assigned roles, but really you can make this what you want to make it. And I've heard many boards really argue about who's going to be president. And I often tell them, that the president isn't really that magical of a position. They chair meetings. They may be a spokesperson for the association, but their vote is as good as anybody else's vote when it comes to motions. So your president is going to be this person who chairs the meetings, probably helps set the agenda, although any director can place items on the agenda. They'll usually be the point of contact with management or with vendors. So they are a bit of a figurehead, but the board can decide, does the president have authority to direct vendors or to approve certain expenses or things like that? That's going to be up to the board to decide. Vice president is a funny position because the vice president does nothing until the president isn't there. So the vice president is just as backup, sort of waiting in the wings. They are the person who's there when the president can't attend a meeting, can't sign a contract, or whatever it may be. They will then step into that role. They could have some other roles as well. Sometimes vice presidents will serve as another officer position, like secretary or treasurer, because the vice president otherwise isn't doing anything in a meeting. The secretary and treasurer position are similar in that their roles are often roles that are fulfilled by management. So, the secretary is typically going to be the person who would take minutes, keeps the corporate records, maybe the ones who sign certain documents or makes the minutes available to the members. But you may decide to delegate that authority to your management staff, which will allow management to do all of that, have one point where the records are kept, and the secretary just kind of helps with that process. So again, that's one that can be defined by the board, how you want to manage and carry that out. Treasurer, same thing. Treasurer is not necessarily going to be completing your ledger each month and filling in your spreadsheets. They're probably going to be the person that may have a little bit more oversight with management on the financials. They may be looking at things or having input. The treasurer may do reports during the board meeting about the association's financials for the month or for the quarter. They may do a report at the annual meeting about the budget. So it's usually someone who's going to have a little more financial acumen, but not necessarily someone who's going to actually be running the books. It's mostly going to be management, and then they may step in sort of an advisory communication type role because they are a bit better at reading and understanding financials than maybe someone else on the board is. So it's usually someone with that more of a financial edge, but they're not going to be the bookkeeper for the association, unless, of course, you have a self-governed association. Then your position of secretary and president will be a lot more, or secretary and treasurer will be a lot more hands-on on managing financials, on taking minutes, on a lot more of those tasks that I just mentioned. So for those who are self-managed associations, your officer roles could actually be a lot more involved, depending on that management involvement or not.
Just a quick note on that, if you don't mind. I know there are boards that rely really heavily on their treasurer or their CFO to be heavily involved in the finances of the association and think that because they've got that person involved, they can kind of take a step back. And that's not actually the case. All board members are required to review the financials regularly and to be well-versed in all the financial information about the association. The treasurer or the CFO may have much more intimate knowledge of all of the details, but every board member is obligated to familiarize themselves and understand what's happening financially with the association.
Yeah, I think that's important. It's important to note. The treasurer, there is a way for the treasurer and one other person to complete the review each month, but the board still needs to know what's going on, still needs to be aware of that financial health throughout the year, and then, of course, adopting the budget.
Okay, and then you have your at-large members, and these are the ones that are not officers. Directors, there's only 3 officers actually required by law under the Corporations Code: president, secretary, and treasurer. Vice president is optional, it's common, and it may be that the vice president may be required by your bylaws. but there is no official position called at-large members. There's nothing in the Corporation Code, nothing in the Robert's Rules of Order. But it's very common that you'll see associations will refer to the non-officer directors as at-large members. And they can be assigned as liaison to committees. They can be assigned duties, just like there's duties assigned to the president, secretary, treasurer. They could be assigned to be, liaison again with committees, or become the expert dealing with reserve issues or other kinds of issues that the board might assign to them. Okay, on committees, these are created by the board, sometimes by charter, oftentimes not. It can be informal, and they serve at the pleasure of the board. The committees that you have are going to be mandatory committees, which are typically defined by the governing documents, and that is more often than not the architectural committee. And then you've got standing committees, and that might be a budget committee that you have that's going to each year prepare a budget and submit it to the board of directors for approval. Then you'll have ad hoc committees, which will be a specialty, a single topic that they want the board to have a committee investigate, come back and make a recommendation to the board. Once the recommendation is made, the committee automatically dissolves. And then you have a special kind of committee, which is the executive committee, which is made up of directors only, whereas all the other committees can be appointed by members of the association, whereas the executive committee only is can only be directors. And then committees, it says here, require board approval by committee decisions. That's not always true. They can, for example, the architectural committee frequently is independently making decisions, and it doesn't go before the board. Now, the decision of the committee can be appealed to the board, but the committee is making that decision. Or the board might delegate to a committee, you can make this decision. Now, the board remains responsible for the committee's decisions, but they can delegate. And I've seen that with rules committees and other kinds of committees where they're making a decision. John or Ellen, you want to comment?
I think one thing to be clear on to make sure, and Adrian, you said this, but I'm just going to reiterate it, and that is the board can only delegate the action, not the responsibility itself. So
Right.
the board is ultimately going to be responsible, legally responsible for decisions that are made by committees, even if the board said, committee, you can make the decision. So it's still going to sit with the board. The buck stops with the board, legally speaking.
Yeah, and when they're talking about one board member who usually sits on committee, I've seen many where the board members are not. They're just board homeowners that are forming the committee, that are on the committee, and then report back to the board. So there's no legal requirement that a board member sit on the committee, although you can. So they can assign a board to sit on a particular committee.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And it's also important if you do assign a board liaison that you decide what that role of the liaison is going to be, because liaison is typically someone who may attend a committee meeting and they're the conduit between the board and the committee as far as sharing information, but they may not have a vote. But sometimes directors, when they get in that liaison role, they want to kind of step in and run the committee, and that can create some trouble. So you want to make sure that's defined as well. What's the liaison's role? Typically, it's going to be they sit and they listen and they share information, but that's it. They don't vote. They don't run the committee. Kind of defining that's going to be important when you have your committees functioning. We're going to shift now to rules and regulations, and Ellen's going to start walking us through that process.
All right. I love rules and regulations. Lawyers love these things. So we're talking about the bottom of the hierarchy. So Adrian had walked you through the hierarchy of governing documents. The rules are at the bottom. And just because they're at the bottom of the hierarchy does not mean that they're not important. And in fact, sometimes they can feel like, or actually play such a big role within association's governance that they can feel extremely important. So there's a reason why we're focusing on them. So starting with the next slide, as Adrian had said, rules and regulations get adopted and adopted and amended by the board. And we contrast that with the way that we amend other governing documents, which require member approval. So this is a very handy way for board members to take some control of the regulations in the community. But there are a few things to keep in mind with this. One is that the phrase operating rules, which is, I realize is not on this screen, but is a statutory term that has a specific definition in the civil code, is subject to a number of requirements, and those are going to be covered in some future slides. But a few things to note there: not all rules are operating rules, but lots and lots of rules are considered operating rules under the definition. And just to clarify, when we say operating rules, we mean what Adrian had mentioned: pets, parking, pools. Right? I like to use pool rules as examples a lot, because as you can imagine, for various reasons, you might, if you have a pool that everyone can access, you may want to have some rules around how it gets used. So as we're going to talk in more detail in a few more slides, not quite ready for that one yet. These are adopted after a 28-day notice and comment period. So it's not as though they're done in secret. The owners are being told what's happening, and they're being given an opportunity to comment and ask questions and raise objections. But at the end of that time period, it is really up to the board to decide whether they are going to adopt this new rule or adopt this amended rule. And what's most important, I think, is that because the operating rules are at the bottom of the hierarchy, they cannot conflict with the other governing documents. If there are any conflicts, whether direct or sometimes even some indirect conflicts among the higher ranked, we'll put it that way, the higher ranked governing documents and the rules, the higher ranked documents are always going to win. So one handy mnemonic device, if you think it's handy and if you like mnemonic devices for remembering the hierarchy, if you'd like, is CABO, which is the C is for CC&Rs, the A is for articles, the B is for bylaws, and the O is for operating rules. There's an L on top of it. As Adrian had said, the law will always supersede everything else. So it could be El Cabo if you like that. But if that helps you remember, then great. All right, so on the next slide.
Well, let me comment on this one.
Yeah.
They're amended by the board, but one of the things I caution boards is that they should have legal review, because sometimes they will adopt rules that are contrary to law and are not enforceable. And so having legal review is, I think, important. The other thing is that they have to give notice once they've adopted them, because they're not effective until they give notice. And one of the things they should not do is record them. I've seen rules recorded with the CC&Rs, and that's really problematic, because then how do you amend them? Because are they deemed part of the CC&Rs? So you simply to give notice to everybody that you've adopted a new rule, and it becomes effective upon notice.
Agreed. Thank you. And along those lines, as it says here on the slide, there doesn't have to be a rule to cover every issue. And there shouldn't probably be a rule to cover every single issue. You're going to want to find some sort of balance between what's necessary in order to have the community function well, function properly, and having a situation where it's potentially unpleasant to live there because every single thing is being micromanaged. And I can't tell you what is right for your community. The board really has to make that decision, but they can consult with legal counsel on that. And really, going back to what Adrian is saying, I wholeheartedly agree. And in fact, there are a number of rules or regulations that council should not only review, but should actually prepare. So things that are heavily ingrained in statute. So things like what we can do with solar, what we can do with electric vehicle charging stations, those are heavily regulated by the law, which means that the policy is going to have to be regulated by the law, which means the lawyer is probably the one who should write those policies, or at least draft them for the board to take a look at to see what they think.
And anything involving children, when you start restricting what children can and can't do, can run afoul of the Civil Rights Department.
100%. Age restrictions will bite you at some point. They always do.
One more point on what Ellen just covered too is that with an architectural process, I've heard many times where a committee will say, well, we don't have a rule against it, so we had to allow it. And that's not what the law says. The law gives the committee some subjective discretion. In fact, there's case law that says you can't cover everything on a house in a set of rules. You can't cover every type of trim or light fixture or plant in a set of rules. So just because it's not addressed in a rule does not mean the committee has to allow it. The committee still has subjective discretion on the architectural process.
Yeah, and to add what John said, there are other kinds of rules, maybe involving pool rules or pet rules or other kinds of things that might be not detailed out, but there's a catch-all that you can use under your CC&Rs. That's the nuisance provision of the CC&Rs. And that frequently can be used as a gap filler on things.
Yeah, that's right. There's two categories of rules we're going to touch on next. There's required rules, and then Adrian's going to explain possible or not required but optional rules. Required rules are listed in the Civil Code, and in part these are required because they have to be included in your annual disclosures. And these are assessment collection policies, your internal and alternative dispute resolution policies, election rules, and then architectural modification application process. The assessment collection policy there's actually two parts to that. One is statutory disclosures that you have to include in your annual disclosures each year, and that comes straight from the Civil Code. And that sort of walks homeowners through the lien and foreclosure process. But then your separate collection policy is going to establish your rate of late fees, when the assessment is considered due and delinquent, your rate of interest that's charged. It's going to have a few of those additional details that is going to be unique to each association, how you want to adopt that. It will often give the board guidance when an account gets turned over to collections. The IDR and ADR policies are, for the most part, going to be your statutory default policies. The Civil Code actually has a default policy for IDR, which is a very good policy. You may want to adjust that a bit if you wanted to have like a certain timeline you put in place, or if you do the IDR meetings on a regular basis every month, you can add some layers to that, but you may just go with the default process under the Civil Code. ADR is very similar. ADR mostly going to be just following the Civil Code. It has to generally be offered before you can file a lawsuit. Election rules will be somewhat unique to each association. They're following the law, but you may have special rules in your bylaws about cumulative voting or proxies. Your director qualifications may change between each association. So every association does have to have its own unique election rules. And again, this year you may want to amend and update your election rules to allow for electronic voting. And then finally, the architectural process, you have to disclose that each year, generally what the process is to change your home or your separate interest. That may be the plain language in your CC&Rs. You may just take that article out of your CC&Rs and stick it in your annual disclosures, but many or maybe even most communities have some type of architectural rules that they separately adopt. So now we'll shift over to the optional rules that each association could consider.
One thing I wanted to add, if it's okay, to the rules required by law is a schedule of fines. It's not required that you have a schedule of fines unless you want to be able to fine people for their violations, in which case it is required by law. So it's optional, but it becomes mandatory if you want to do the thing, which is to impose fines.
Excellent point. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, of course, optional rules dealing with pools, pets, parking, community use, smoking, nuisance noise, things that really aggravate people. You want to adopt rules generally that will help keep them from clashing if you can avoid it. And where they get upset is nuisance noise, pets leaving their presence on the lawn, smoking drifting between units. And so you need to have rules that deal with those issues. And the smoking, I've dealt more, it seems, with pot smoking in units recently than anything else, where they claim that they have a right to smoke. They have a doctor's order. It's medicinal use. They may have a right to smoke marijuana, but not if it's going to cause problems with their neighbors. And frequently it's a neighbor. One I had was a judge, and they were subject to testing, and she was a federal judge, and she was very concerned that getting it into her system because it's drifting from the neighbor was going to get her fired. And another instance, it was because they had young children in the neighboring unit. So boards can deal with these. They can adopt rules that address these issues as needed. So that doesn't mean they have to have all the rules all up front at the beginning. It may be that they'll make amendments and adopt different rules as issues come up that they need to address.
So some rules and regulation don'ts. These are very broad don'ts, so take them with a grain of salt and consult with counsel. You don't want to get too detailed, except where you do want to get detailed. So the caution here is simply that you don't want to necessarily micromanage to the point where it becomes so unpleasant to live there, or so impossible to enforce. And that's really a big part of this. Whenever a board imposes rules and regulations, which can be very important, they then take on the obligation to enforce those rules and regulations. So becoming too detailed could make that very challenging. You don't want to focus on any particular members. These need to be widespread rules and regulations which apply to everyone and equally to everyone. Avoiding heavy-handedness, we've talked about. Targeting children. Fair housing laws do not like age restrictions. So it looks as though the big, mean association bully is trying to discriminate against families with children. So while there are lots and lots of very well-meaning boards who put age restrictions on the use of certain amenities, typically pools, gyms, clubhouses, it is possible that the way that they are written will come out as a violation of fair housing laws. And you won't find that out unless A, your counsel takes a look at your rules and says, hey, red flag, we should change this, or you get called by HUD or the Civil Rights Division in California, and they start an investigation. So I'm going to give you an example of how this can be remedied. But again, this is something to talk to counsel about. So I like to use the example of pool rules here because well-meaning boards are thinking, well, we don't want anyone under the age of blank, let's say 12, unaccompanied by an adult, because we want them to be safe. We want them to be watched. We want them to be observed. Well, the reason why you should not have a rule that says that is because a 7-year-old who's on a swim team may be a very, very good swimmer, whereas a 45-year-old who's not on a swim team may be a terrible swimmer. But it's actually the 45-year-old that's posing the risk because they're the ones who need to be accompanied by someone who's watching them. So the better way to do this is to say something like, anyone who cannot swim or use the swimming pool area safely unaccompanied must be accompanied. And that encompasses anyone of any age, anyone of any health condition, etc., and doesn't single out families with children. There's a note here on passing rules on or not passing rules on sharply split votes. For example, if you have 3 people who on the board, on a 5-member board, who say yes, let's do this, and 2 that say no, I'm going to leave this to the board's discretion. It is something to consider when there's a split decision, because it may be challenging for a board that is split in that way to take on the enforcement portion of the rules once they are adopted. But I also want to just remind everyone that the decision of a majority of a quorum of the board is a decision of the board. So whether or not it's a sharply split vote on this or not, the decision of a majority of a quorum of the board is the decision of the board, and everyone on the board is then expected to fall in line behind that decision once it's made. Again, I'm not saying that that's clean and easy in real life, but that's big picture. And then some regulation dues. You definitely want to explain to members why the rule is needed. And in fact, it's required under the statute to let members know the purpose and effect of the new rule or the purpose and effect of the amended rule. Again, we want to focus on all members, not just one specific member who may still be there or may not be there anymore. I agree that we should emphasize the clarification of neighborly conduct, not just the regulation itself. We're trying to have a community, right? You're trying to run a business, you're trying to run a community, you're trying to run a mini government, but emphasis on the community can go a long way when discussing these kinds of rules or putting them forth to the members for their comment during their comment period. You are going to need to allow for other viewpoints during either the drafting period and or the comment period, but you don't have to create rules that please everyone. You may not ever be able to create rules that please everyone, especially if it's about pets and parking. Guaranteed there will be no parking rules that make every single person feel warm and fuzzy. And another do is to adopt rules on consensus. You're trying for a 5-0 vote. You're trying for everyone to agree. And yes, you're looking for consensus, but that doesn't mean that you have to have the consensus in order to adopt the rule or the amended rule.
The process for adopting rules is a regulated and somewhat regimented process, but it's not overly complicated. The few foundations that we touched upon, we're just going to cover again here, is that rules must be in writing. It can't be kind of an unwritten rule that everyone's expected to follow within the authority of the board. So regulating the common area, regulating separate interests, those are all going to be within the authority of the board. Areas that are outside the board's authority are regulating what someone posts on social media. There's actually a law that was passed about that a couple of years ago. So the board has some parameters as how far it can adopt rules. Must be consistent with the governing documents and governing law. Again, it must follow the law, things like solar, EV panels, signs, solar, EV chargers, signs, all those things are regulated by law, can't conflict with the law, must be consistent with your governing documents, and adopted in good faith and complying with the law regarding the process. So is the board doing this in good faith, or are they doing this out of spite for a particular person who was a former director who has a particular car they no longer want to allow? So consider that. What's the motivation behind it? It must be reasonable. Reasonable is a term we love to use in the law, but to understand it in the context of rules, reasonable means it's not arbitrary, capricious, or a violation of public policy. So arbitrary, there's no reason for it. If you say no bike riding on Wednesdays, well, why? Why Wednesday versus Tuesday? Is there any reason for that other than just the board wanted to do it? Or we don't allow a certain type of window. Well, that could be reasonable if you can explain why. Maybe the window leaks, it doesn't match. But if you just don't like a particular brand, you have to really explain why it is. Can't violate public policy. We are getting a lot of public policy lately around things like ADUs or clean energy use. We have to find out, is our rule violating public policy on expanding housing in California? Is our rule violating public policy when it comes to smoking, for example? There's different rules around that. Public policy tends to want to prohibit smoking. Is there flexibility there as to how we can regulate that? And then it must comply with the law. So those are our parameters that we're going to work within on the reasonableness context. The topics are the rule can deal with the common area or exclusive use common area, the separate interest use, architectural standards, delinquent assessments. It can be the enforcement process, the schedule of fines. Rules can regulate almost anything in the association as long as it's within the authority of the association. So telling somebody you're not allowed to cook eggs, that's probably outside the board's authority. You can't regulate the type of food someone makes. But telling somebody that you can't smoke on your back porch because it flows into your neighbor's window is something we could possibly regulate. So there's different areas where we can regulate and some areas where we can't. It's going to depend on the authority of the association under the governing documents. The process involves a member comment period. It's going to be a 2-meeting process. The board meets, considers the draft rules, then publishes the rules to the members for a 28-day comment period. Then the board will meet again, consider any comments. You don't have to do anything with the comments, but at least you consider them. Then if the board adopts the rules as published, the board will give notice to the members within 15 days of that adoption, making the members aware these are our new rules regarding elections or regarding architectural changes. And then after that, rules can be reversed. There's a process where the members can submit a petition signed by at least 5% of the members to call for a special vote to overturn the rules. This has to be done within 30 days of the notice of the rule change. So it's a very short window to exercise this. And then a majority of a quorum can vote to overturn the rules. I've actually seen this happen a few times. And the point that Ellen was making earlier about avoiding rules that are done on split votes sort of gets to this point, because if the board is split on a particular rule, the community might be split as well. And if you in the comment period are feeling a large groundswell of members opposing a rule, it's important to pause and consider, do we have a lot of opposition to this rule? Because the last thing you want to have happen is you adopt a rule and then the members do this petition and force you to run an election, which costs money, and then the members essentially veto what the board has done. That really takes the wind out of the board's sails if the members go to overturn a rule. So if you feel like there's a lot of resistance, maybe take a step back, find out what's going on, what the issue is, and then decide, is this rule worth it, or is this going to completely set us back and possibly undermine the board's authority? If you do get that rule reversal through an election process, then the board cannot readopt that rule for 1 year. So if it's an area that's important for the board to regulate, you have to take that into consideration. Do you want to try and force a rule that could be overturned, because that will then effectively deregulate that area, however you're changing the rules?
And John is right on a groundswell of opposition. I attended a town hall meeting where the association was adopting a rule involving dogs, in particular dogs, not just pets in general. And there was huge opposition. And one woman was very passionate and claimed that dogs were people too, and that we couldn't regulate them. So talk to the board about backing up, and let's see if we can't revise it and make it something that would be acceptable. Otherwise, it's going to be the process that John just outlined was going to be very costly and very problematic for the board of directors.
Yeah.
Okay, enforcement. Before you go to legal, yes, legal does get involved from time to time in enforcement, but we shouldn't be the first, default run to legal on an issue. In fact, what you should do is talk to somebody. If they're in violation, they may not realize that they're in violation, and you just talk to them. And I think go to the next slide, John. I think that may be covered, and just chat with them. And this is where management can pick up the phone and talk to them, or a board member, talk to them and see if they can't resolve it just informally. If you can't, if that doesn't work, then you go to the next step. And that may be that there's going to be internal dispute resolution, which is an informal, a director, one or two directors meeting with a person and to deal with it. In fact, yesterday I was in an IDR where an owner was in dispute or was in violation, and we were going to the next step because we couldn't get them to comply. We made a pre-litigation ADR demand on them, or offer of ADR, and they immediately came back with a request for IDR, and they were bringing their attorney. So I attended as well, and we met with them, and unfortunately it was not successful. But it's an opportunity to meet and confer and to try to resolve an issue, a violation issue, before it gets escalated. And then you've got the external enforcement procedures, which are mediation, arbitration, and litigation. And generally you start with an offer of ADR, and that's going to be either mediation or arbitration. Typically, we always go to mediation. We rarely, if ever, offer arbitration, because binding arbitration, while it can be less expensive than litigation, the problem is binding. And you may end up with a result that you really want to appeal, but you can't because you agreed to binding arbitration. But there may be situations where binding arbitration is appropriate. On occasion, we have used it. And then there's litigation. And that may be, there are times when you just have no choice. The person is not giving you an option, and you end up having to file suit against them in order to get compliance. We try to avoid it wherever possible because it's usually litigation is more expensive than boards realize. And it's also emotionally draining on directors, especially when there's a counterclaim back against the board of directors. So litigation is not the best solution. It should be the last option that you go to. John or Ellen, do you want to comment on this?
Well, one other thing I'd say about litigation, as far as why we use it with caution, is because we can't guarantee the outcome. So it's very possible that an association will win when it pursues litigation against an owner for their violations of the rules or other governing documents, but there is no guarantee that the association is going to win that lawsuit.
And even if you do win, I've had cases that I've tried all the way through a trial. They've gone up on appeal. We won on appeal. It's come back down. We get attorney's fees. We get them paid. And the board at the end of that case still wishes they never did it. Litigation is an unpleasant process at best that involves having your deposition taking, spending a lot of money, a lot of things, as Ellen said and Adrian said, you can't expect. I've had motions that I thought were a surefire win and they've lost. And I've had motions that I thought were a reach and the judge just loved them. You never know what you're going to get with a judge. They're people like the rest of us, and they decide based upon what they think. And maybe they like HOAs, maybe they don't. You never know. And so there's a lot of things that go into that. And litigation is also full of surprises. I've had cases that we file thinking this is a surefire case, the strongest thing. The board was convinced, and all of a sudden a deposition is taken, and I hear a board member just start spilling all these things that they're doing in their backyard that are against the rules. Or minutes come out, or I find out there was an architectural approval that got lost in the management transition. Those types of things, all of a sudden it'll sink a case that you thought was good and you're paying a lot of money. So litigation, even when you think it's the best option, it's not always a pleasant option, but it may be required because the board has a duty to enforce. So just keep that in mind that it's not always great, even if you win.
Yeah, and John is right. Both John and Ellen saying the unpredictability of litigation. And the same thing is true of arbitration, which is why I shy away from it. I had an arbitration once where an owner was running a business in their house. This was a planned development, gated community, and he had modified the second story to make it all offices. And he had employees who were checking in at the gate, coming in and working during the day and then going home. The board was upset about it and said, we've got to stop, because there's a CC&R provision that says you can't run a business from your house. Yeah, and this was a clear violation. And the board said, I want to take this to arbitration. And I said, okay, this is one of the exceptions. This is where I think you've got a slam dunk. You can't lose. Okay, I never say that now. Because we went to arbitration, and all the testimony, all the evidence was he's running a business contrary to the CC&Rs. We lost. I went running to court to appeal, and the judge said, "Did you guys agree to binding arbitration?" "Yes, Your Honor." I said, "Well, what are you doing in my courtroom?" Okay, and then what we found out later was that the arbitrator, retired judge, was running his arbitration business from his house and his association. He didn't like the restriction. And so that's why he ruled against the association. So this is the unpredictability that John and Ellen are talking about. You just don't know, which is why we go into mediation, we push mediation, and we look for a good, strong mediator because they can usually get the matter resolved.
We have one last topic on due process for imposing fines, and then we'll have time for our questions. So we'll be to the question portion in just a minute here.
Yes, I'll go quickly. All right, so due process is important. Before a board imposes any kind of discipline on a member, they are required to provide due process to that member. So when I say discipline, I mean things like imposing a fine, imposing a reimbursement assessment, restricting someone's access to use the swimming pool for a period of time. So the thing to remember from this slide is notice any hearing. They have to have notice of their violation or alleged violation, and they have to have an opportunity to be heard at a hearing. So you must provide written notice to the member at least 10 days prior to the hearing. They have the right to attend and address the board. The member can request that the hearing be held in executive session. Frankly, it should be held in executive session because enforcement actions are confidential and are an appropriate topic for executive session. So that's how they should be held. And then written notice to the member of the discipline that the board decides to impose has to be sent within 15 days of the decision. Failure to comply with this could void the action. So if the board does not provide notice in a hearing properly, then the discipline that the board then imposes could be voided if the owner challenges the process. Another note on the IDR, internal dispute resolution statutory procedures. We've talked a lot about IDR on other slides. So just a couple of notes here. The civil code requires that you have a procedure, or you can default to what is in the civil code. You can just do the default. Lots of associations do. It's not a crisis. But if you want to, as I think John had said, if you want to structure things a little bit differently, then you're going to need to have your own procedure in place. The association will need to have their own procedure in place. And sometimes IDR, not quite the area, sometimes IDR is also called meet and confer. When an owner requests an IDR or meet and confer, the association cannot refuse, it must provide it. If the association requests that an owner meet and confer or do IDR, the owner can refuse. It is not, it is voluntary for owners, it is mandatory for associations when they are requested. The board is going to designate at least one member of the board to conduct and be part of the meet and confer with the owner. And the rules need to say that you will meet promptly at a mutually convenient time and place. That place can be Zoom. You want to talk about, as frankly as you can, about the relative positions of the parties and try to find a way to resolve the dispute. The meet and confer and IDR is a method to resolve disputes. And if a resolution is reached, if some sort of end can be reached, can be met by the parties, it needs to be written and signed so that it can be enforceable. And then last but not least, we have this last slide. This is just a step-by-step approach, a flowchart approach to dealing with dispute resolution, dealing with enforcement issues, and imposing discipline. This is one way to approach enforcement and discipline. It is not the only way to approach enforcement and discipline. There are certain steps that aren't going to be required. If you're not required to send a warning letter, you don't have to send a warning letter. Meaning, if sending a warning letter is not a required step in your policies, in your CC&Rs, or wherever, you don't necessarily have to do that. It can be a useful step, but it's not necessarily something you have to do. It might not even be something that's prudent depending on the circumstances. If someone sets fire to a portion of the common area, don't bother with a warning letter if you can get away with it. Go straight to notice in a hearing. They set fire to the common area, also probably call the police. But in any event, my point is that this is one way to approach things. It is not the only way to approach things. And that is our last slide.
Thank you so much, guys. That was a lot of information that you got through. We really appreciate it. We did get some questions in the chat, but I'm saving them for the next section because it's basically all Q&A. So guys, if you do have more questions, please keep putting them in the chat. They'll be answered in the order that they are received. Do you guys, as speakers, do you guys want to take a second to take a stretch break or anything before we go on? Okay.
No, good.
Okay, cool. Thanks, guys. All right. So first off, we have a raffle prize from Josh Renwick from Good Life. I'm going to bring him up here because he's got a raffle prize for us, and I have a wheel for him to spin. But Josh, do you want to remind us who you are, what you do, what you're raffling?
Again, Josh with Good Life. We are your construction, restoration, pest control inspection company, and we do have a $100 raffle gift card that we'll be giving away. Whoever wins it, I can either drop in the mail or I can come by your office.
Thank you so much. All right, let me bring up the wheel. Oh my gosh, it's been so long since I've done the wheel. All right, do we see the wheel?
We see it.
Okay,
Yes.
let's go. Jessica Ross, Integrity Alliance Management. Congratulations. I know you're on here. I saw her. Thank you so much, Josh. We really appreciate it and your sponsorship, and we'll see you soon. And I'll get you her information as well. Jessica, if you want to put it in the chat or send it to him, you can do that as well. Let me this. All right, so we have some questions for you guys already, so we'll start with that. And we're getting some great session in the chat as well. Can boards reduce the amount of money going to reserves to pay for an operating expense? Is this considered a loan from the reserves? Is this legal?
Well, that's certainly not in the stuff we covered, our topics, but there is a kind of a split of opinion on that. If you're reducing your reserve contributions in order to take care of operations, I personally don't like that. They need to be funding their reserves so that they take care of things. If there's an operational issue, such as their insurance premiums just went up unexpectedly, which everybody is going to be experiencing as a result of the LA fires, they should do a special assessment. And it can be an emergency special assessment to deal with it, and then increase their regular dues in their budget for the next year. I don't know, John or Ellen, do you guys think differently?
Well, I tend to agree that reducing the reserve funding is never a great option. The reserves need to be funded, and it's the long-term funding plan for major maintenance. But the law doesn't require the funding of reserves. The law requires a reserve study, but not the funding. And the law says that the restrictions on a temporary transfer from reserves contemplates the money already went into the reserves, and it wasn't simply a budget reallocation. So I think there's some flexibility there. If you had a short-term funding need that you maybe it exceeded the amount of the special assessment, you maybe had to do a member vote, but you can't quite accomplish that yet. There is I think some room there to sort of defer some of that funding to reserves or withhold some of that funding to meet a short-term cash flow need. But you're going to want to plan how to get that caught up later, because the reserves aren't going away, and that reserve study still expects a certain amount of funds. But this is an area where there's some reasonable differences of opinion that it's important to talk to the association's counsel about it.
Yeah, and I'll agree with John on that.
Yeah, I completely agree that this is a question for that particular association's legal counsel, because that association's counsel is going to understand the community itself and the details around this. This is a lot of it depends, which I understand are answers from lawyers that nobody wants to hear, but it depends in large part on what is going on sometimes. So I agree with both John and Adrian. There is some wiggle room, but I don't like it. So it makes me itchy. It makes a lot of us itchy for lots of different reasons, because what is happening is, even if it were allowed under the circumstances and different protective measures are being taken, it still poses risk for various reasons. So for all of that, I would say it may be possible for a very short-term issue, but it's something that counsel really should advise on very specifically.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. Okay. Our next question is there a difference between what California allows and what the federal government allows in relation to reserve expenditures?
In relation to what? You dropped off there.
Oh, sorry. In relation to reserve expenditures.
No, there's no federal standards for reserves at this point. The CAI has some recommendations on reserves,
Right.
but there's no federal laws regarding reserves.
Right.
That was easy. Okay. What needs to be included in the open board meeting minutes? Should there be a transcript of what was said?
No.
No.
Please, please, please get away from a transcript of what was said. Please do not let your minutes look like the script to a play. Please. Adrian, do you want to go into detail on what should be? We talked about this a bit before,
Yeah.
before we started.
Minutes are required to record actions of the board, not a word by word, description of what everybody said, comments by board members, comments by homeowners. They can get themselves in trouble if they do that. So I'm with Ellen. It's a clear no.
Great. Thank you, guys.
I will
Oh,
say, I'm sorry, Rachel, I apologize for interrupting, but I will say this. I think that well-meaning boards and well-meaning managers do this in the interest of, I'm going to call it transparency in quotes. I don't mean that transparency is wrong or bad, but my point is that the law tells us what transparency actually means and what transparency has to be for the association to its members and to others. So the idea that we're going to do something beyond that or in the interest of quote transparency is essentially not recognizing what is required versus not required and what might actually pose more risk than protection.
great. Thank you so much. Can you combine two positions on the board?
Yes. This, you're talking about officer positions like secretary treasurer. That's fairly common, especially with small associations with a small board of only 3 directors. I'll see a president and then I'll see a secretary treasurer.
Okay, that's great to know. Are any board positions more important than others?
No,
Everyone gets one vote. Depends on how the board wants to structure it.
That's so simple. Look at all these answers. Okay. What if a couple board members are trying to change a couple rules because of a few residents complaining about them?
They
Well,
can't.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
if it's merited, I mean, they can raise it and discuss it in a board meeting, and then the board can decide yes or no.
Sometimes when a few members are agitating about something, they are representing a bigger or bringing to light a bigger issue that needs to be explored more fully. And sometimes it's just a couple of residents that are agitating for something that's their own, personal beef about something. And it's up to the board to decide to look into it and decide, is this something we actually need to take on, or is this something that, is just personal to them?
Awesome. Thank you so much. How should a board address neighbor to neighbor issues when it is a he said, she said with no proof from either side? What do they need to do to close the matter?
It's a great question, and it's a common one we deal with a lot. The first issue is investigate to
Right.
the extent that the board can. Find out what's going on. The threshold question is this related to unlawful discrimination? If it's related to unlawful discrimination because of someone's protected class status, their race, religion, sexual orientation, board has a duty to get involved. If it's not, if it's just because people don't like each other and they don't get along well, then if there's a clear violation of the governing documents, like someone has a dog that is running off leash all the time, you have to deal with it. If it's just people not getting along and it's kind of petty stuff, like they're looking over my fence, they barbecue every night, they talk in their backyard. I have one right now where people watch TV in their backyard, but it's at a reasonable volume. There's not a duty to get involved. In fact, there's a recent case that just came out a couple months ago over neighbors that were sort of nasty to each other, almost to the point of I think violence and threats and things like that. And the court said the board has no duty to get involved in that. That's a law enforcement issue. We enforce CC&Rs, but we don't deal with neighbors getting along all the time. We're not the friend police.
Yeah, and to add to what John said, if you have an owner who comes in and complains, this other owner is letting their dog off the leash all the time. They're not cleaning up after the dog does her business on the lawn. And it comes to the board has duty to investigate. And it's he said, she said. Interestingly enough, the board can make a decision that we believe this person over this one. They can make that decision as who they think is more credible in their testimony or in what they're reporting, because courts do that all the time. Juries do that all the time. They find who they believe is credible and who's not credible. So they are allowed to make a decision even in a he said, she said situation.
And when we say investigate, we're talking about things like inviting the various parties to meet and confer separately so that the board can get more information from them about the situation and their position and what it is that they want, potentially talking to other neighbors or others who might be familiar with the situation, essentially getting as much information as the board can within a reasonable framework. and then making a decision about, right, who is most credible, or what should we do, or what can we do here. So no one is saying, oh, it's neighbor to neighbor, leave it alone. What we're saying is investigate, and then the board gets to decide whether or not it's going to take further action beyond the investigation or not.
Right.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Who is responsible to perform pest inspections?
That depends on your CC&Rs.
Right.
Okay, that was easy. Um, the report for SB 326 becomes a record of the association. Should it be available to owners and lenders, or any structural inspection reports not listed under 4525 or 5205?
Interestingly, we have a disagreement even within our firm. I say yes. There's no reason to withhold it. I have another attorney in the firm who says no, they shouldn't do it. It creates potential liability. So I don't know, John, Ellen, what do you guys think?
I agree with Adrian on this point. I say don't hide the ball. Let them know flat out,
Right,
all your balconies are safe, or no, they're not. I'd
right.
rather the members know that their balcony is not safe than, it is what it is. If a balcony falls off the building, whether it's in a report or not, we're on the hook for it. So play it like it is and then go fix it.
So I'm a little bit in the middle here, which is to say that it's the board's decision. And so because it's not required under the law, the board, in my opinion, our firm's opinion, the board needs to understand the relative pros and cons, the risks and benefits of doing the thing that's not required. And then the board gets to decide. Like, they take on the risk, or what have you, they make that decision. And then from there, we go on with things. So I think that it really depends on what the board wants and what their appetite for risk is. There is some risk in providing it. There is some risk in not providing it. And so it's something that the board has to weigh, in my opinion.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I have one last question. So guys, if you have any other questions, now's the time to get them in, or we're just going to end early, okay? Okay, last question. Should the board report decisions made in an executive session? And if so, how?
Well, they do have to generally report out what was covered in executive session, such as we had a disciplinary hearing, we discussed legal matters involving current litigation, but they don't have to provide details. And they shouldn't be reporting out that so-so had a dog leash violation and we fined the person, $100. Okay, that's kind of details should not be coming out of executive session. But it is okay to report out that we did have a violation hearing. No, John, Ellen, what do you guys think?
Agreed. Ultimately, what you're reporting, and I don't know, I don't quite know what reporting means, right? Is it something that gets announced at an open meeting later? Is it what gets put in executive session meeting minutes? Executive session meeting minutes are not supposed to be accessed by owners. So they are an official record of the corporation. They do need to be maintained, but owners do not have the right to review them. If you're talking about reporting back in an open session or some other forum about what happened, then as Adrian said, you have to stay very general. And that's typically what's done in the agenda as it is. So the agenda for the executive session will say something like member discipline, but it's not going to list who, it's not going to list what, it's not going to list any of the details.
There's one area that may be worth doing some reporting, and that's if a board does all of their contract decisions in executive session. Then it's a good practice at your next open meeting to say, we approved to do a landscape contract, or we approved a contract to fix the patio cover, whatever that may be, to keep members informed that work is being done, maintenance is being done, services may change, because contracts can be done mostly or all in executive session. So that would be an area where reporting is a good thing.
I agree.
Okay, great. Thank you. We did get another question in. Thank you to Miranda Ward from Adam Sterling on the back end. She's our education committee chair for the Cal North chapter. She's been taking the questions and, making sure that I can read them correctly. So I appreciate her. I'm going to read the next question. If a resident has had an ongoing violation, can you have them go straight to the board, or do I need to start at the courtesy notice, even if they have had a few courtesy notices from previous management?
Courtesy notices are not required under the statutes. They're only potentially required by the governing documents. So it really depends on what the governing documents require. If the CCNRs, or perhaps there's an enforcement policy or schedule of fines, if they require a warning, a courtesy notice, things like that, then you have to follow those procedures. But if not, then you absolutely do not have to do any of that.
Yeah, and I agree with Ellen, which is why I don't like rules, enforcement procedures that say you have to do a letter first. Because as the example you gave, they set fire to the common areas, we're not going to be doing a warning letter. We're going to go be straight to a hefty fine. And, and there may be other things that would require you going to and just before I forget, I have had boards in the past that will do daily fines on a violation. And I had one that got up to into the 100,000 plus in fines, and then wanted me to go collect those fines. Well, you can't do that. If you're imposing a daily fine on a violation, okay, maybe 30 days maximum, and then you need to take action. You can't just let it run, and so that in anticipation that you're going to get a windfall of money coming into the association.
I agree.
Well, that was the last question on my list. So unless you guys have any other imparting wisdom you would like to leave, because this is being recorded, so we will have people watching it throughout the year who did not get a chance to ask questions. So if there is anything that you hear often, and you think would be good to say, sorry to put you on the spot.
Well, in general, boards do have an obligation to enforce their governing documents, and they need to do it not in a heavy-handed way that they create huge animosity in the community, but they do need to be consistent and even-handed in how they deal with their rules enforcement, their governing documents. And it's an important part of an association and a board's duties.
I agree.
I agree. One thing to consider too for your hearings, think about how your tables are arranged for your board hearings. If you have the board all lined up and the homeowners in front of them, it becomes a more adversarial process. Think about maybe arranging tables in kind of a U or a circle or a square and the members amongst the board. That can often reduce some tensions, and the board's not losing any of its authority, but when the homeowner feels like they are not in that adversarial position, it can help lead to resolutions more, and the homeowner feels like the board is still with them, but needs to get them to comply. So there's more of a working relationship there.
Yeah, good point.
That's great advice. Well, thank you, speakers. We really appreciate you for your time and for all of this great information. Attendees, thank you for joining us on this 3-day journey. I know it's a lot of time spent, so we really appreciate it. We're seeing a lot of thank you and very informative in the chat. And again, we will be sending you out a end of the day email with the contact information for our speakers, as well as a link to today's webinar and the previous 2 days webinars if you want to catch up on that. Your certificates will be sent out by Friday at the latest, and you should have your $5 Starbucks gift card in email today. So with that, our board leader certificate course for 2025 comes to an end. Yay!
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.